Well, today's going to be a real fun things hidden discussion. In the spirit of the Christmas season, I'm continuing some of our series where we have roundtable discussions with various individuals who are good friends of mine and doing good work in their respective fields to advance the kingdom, ultimately the kingdom of heaven and their callings, but also we are all passionate about mimetic theory and Christian anthropology and how we apply that. So for those listening, I have Jerry Bowyer, who is an editor of various outlets. He'll get into it when we give everybody an intro, but he's a good friend of mine. He's a writer. He's an investor. He's a theologian. He wrote The Maker versus the Takers, which is a fascinating look at Jesus engaging social justice and economics. It's fascinating stuff. I have Jason Jones, who's a film producer, an activist, a writer. You can see his stuff at The Stream. You can see him on the Jason Jones Show. We also have Pastor Jim Fitzgerald, who's a longtime friend of mine and someone who's also a writer and a theologian in his own right in the way he works in the Middle East. But I wanted to give you guys an opportunity to kind of throw out your, your own introduction or how you came to understand mimetic theory in that work. So let's start with Jerry.
Well, you covered a lot. I'm an economist. I'm an economist in private practice, meaning I'm involved with money management, not an academic economist. I'm a Christian. And I look at Christianity, I look at economics and everything through a specifically Christian lens. And I have a lot of influences economically and theologically, and Girard is easily top 3 or 4. I wrote his obit for Forbes, where I used to be a journalist. Now I'm a journalist with a Christian Post and also with World Magazine's new opinion page. And you mentioned my book, The Maker versus the Takers, which is about economics, but anybody who's read Girard is going to see the Girardian undertones in that book. So thoroughly committed Girardian and a mere Christian in the sense that I don't have strong denominational commitments, but rather just commitments to the shared Christian faith. And I'm ordained as a clergyman and have served in different capacities, but bivocational, which means, not my day job, do it for free on the weekends. My day job is basically helping to do macroeconomic forecasting and increasingly proxy engagement, like dealing with the issue of voting, of how people vote with their shares when it comes to annual meetings as a way to deal with the ideological capture and scapegoating that's been occurring in public corporations. That's probably more than you needed, but there you go.
Thank you. Jason?
Yeah, my name is Jason Jones. I'm a filmmaker and I run a human rights organization. About 30 years ago, as a young soldier, just some personal experiences, I committed that I wanted to live the rest of my life trying to get between the vulnerable and the violence by running influence campaigns for vulnerable communities. But strangely, I didn't discover Rene Girard until about 12 years ago when I was just submitted my first book to the publisher. And I'm glad I didn't discover Girard until after I submitted the book, because would have probably pushed it back another 10 years or so before I got it to the publisher. It was anthropology. I was an atheist as a young 17-year-old, 18-year-old atheist, Ayn Rand objectivist infantryman, struggling to explain this exalted vision of the human person that I saw as self-evident over a 10-year journey that really led through Nietzsche and Sartre and Freud, led me to Catholicism. And in about 2002, 2001, I was in Washington, D.C. at the Catholic Information Center. And I heard someone say, this book, they held up a copy of I See Satan Fall. And they said, this is one of Pope Benedict's favorite books. And I bought the book, but because the cover is so unattractive and it looks like something that was made by some fly-by-night publisher in a guy's basement, I didn't read it for about 10 or 11 years. They need to publish that book with a new cover. But reading Rene Girard helped me understand one thing: why I am relentlessly failing in my tasks to defend the vulnerable while still remaining likable to those who are in power. The idea that I just interviewed Father Frank Pavone on my podcast. To stand with the scapegoat is to become indistinguishable from the scapegoat. And when we seek to advance the interests of those truly vulnerable communities, whether it's the Uyghur in Chinese-occupied East Turkestan or the child in the womb, when we're trying to influence those who are in power, we're going to find that we are relentlessly shunned. So that was a great relief that it wasn't me. It was the nature of the work that I do. So yeah, it's a privilege to be here today with you guys.
Thank you, Jason. You've also, I don't know if you mentioned that, but I like to say you're a film producer because you do make a lot of great films that touch on some of these themes too. So
yeah, my movies are sort of ancillary. I started making movies because I started, as a young activist knocking on doors, and I thought the silver screen is probably a more practical way of trying to reach millions of people than door knocking. So it really is an expression of my commitment to promote human dignity and inspire solidarity. And by God's grace, we've had some success. So people think I'm a filmmaker when really I'm just an activist.
very good. And Pastor Jim?
Yeah, it's great to be with you guys today, and thank you, David, for inviting us. I'm a pastor in the Presbyterian Church in America, and I've been with the PCA since I think 2000, and or maybe a little before. I pastored for about 13 years, and then became a missionary in an independent organization called Equipping Pastors International. And my primary focus is in North Africa and the Middle East. And we're working with churches and there from, people from a Christian background, but also working with people from a Muslim background. And I was first introduced to Rene Girard by David Gornoski, and received my first copy of I See Satan Fallen from David. So I can't remember exactly how many years ago that was, David. Do you? But
It's been a while. Yeah.
Yeah, it's been a while. But at any rate, that's how I came to be influenced by Girard's writing and teaching. I've developed a small course on his anthropology that I teach at our seminary in Egypt, at New Geneva Theological Seminary in Egypt, and it's been a big help there because one of the things that has invaded the church in Egypt has been this emphasis through the liberal church on mythology, and so I thought Girard is a perfect perfect way to introduce them to sort of the anti-myth, or what unveils the myth, and so we've been teaching that course annually over there.
So all of you have been an influence on my Christian walk and understanding of politics and current events. And it's a real honor to have you all on here. I want to kind of start off, we can go all over the place and you guys can interact and ask questions or jump in or whatever you're going to do, and trying to keep some order so far in the way we're doing this. What is something about, because all of you have an interesting way of giving people Middle Eastern or Near Eastern eyes and understanding some of the things going on in the Bible, and for various ways. You're over there in different capacities. Jerry, in your book, The Maker versus the Takers, you do a great job of illustrating, and giving a lot of context to the archaeological and understanding of what was going on in that region. But what's something that, mimetic theory and the anthropology of Rene Girard has helped inform Christmas and the Advent season in a way that, they give you fresh perspective on the story, Jerry?
Well, a lot. Girard helps with the fresh perspective quite a bit on the nativity narratives and the slaughter of the innocents, etc. I would say the big idea here is that it's a very common theme in the Bible, although not often seen, that there are succession battles. And succession battles are a very common form of mimetic rivalry. So going back to Cain and Abel, which I think is a mimetic rivalry over a succession. Who will succeed Adam in his role? Cain wants 2, wants to do so, grabs that. Abel, on the other hand, doesn't have the same view. Abel is willing to be alongside Cain. Cain wants to be alone. And once you get there, you see that almost on every page in the Bible. And then the nativity narratives are essentially recasting that. And it helps if you read a lot of Josephus or Philo, et cetera, because there are so many succession battles. There's Roman succession battles, and the Hasmoneans end up there's Greek succession battles between Ptolemy and Seleucids, and then the Hasmoneans, which is the regime that's basically in control with Jesus, they take over, invent crucifixion to deal with their enemies. And then there's another succession battle within there, which is Herod versus the alternatives, and he's killing off his rivals. This is mimetic entanglement. This is mimetic rivalry. Who's the king? Who's king of the Jews? Herod wanted it so badly that he wasn't even a Jew. He pretended to be so that he could have that role. And along comes a rumor of the Messiah, who is the king of the Jews. That's what the Messiah is. It's a Messiah. Messiah means anointed. So Herod immediately kind of kicks into mimetic rivalry and ends up doing what he's always done, which is kill rivals. And all there that's background, in the nativity stories. And because we come to the nativity stories through church life, so when I think about the nativity stories, I associate them with Christmas cookies, and I associate them with not very well done but extremely adorable Christmas pageants with little kids in sheep outfits and all the rest of it. There's a kind of a sentimentality that hangs over the nativity stories. But historically, murder hangs over them. The brother-brother violence, which occurs when two people want the same thing, and there's only one of them. We can both want the same thing, if there's more of them, right? We can both want a car if we can both buy cars, if they make more cars, but we can't both be the one and only ruler of Israel or of the Roman Empire. So wherever there is the desire for something that there's only one of them, more than one people desire it, they get mimetically entangled, and that can turn into violence. And Jesus is coming into that. And there's a foreshadowing here with Bethlehem, which is Bethlehem, house of bread, right? So his sacrifice, his willingness to be a human sacrifice, but not lie about whether he's guilty, and have disciples who will not participate in the lie whether he's guilty. That's what makes him bread for the world. And he's born to be a sacrifice. Bethlehem was the town where the local industry was the breeding and raising of sheep to be exported to the temple for the sacrificial system. So sacrifice is hanging over the nativity now before you even get to the swaddling cloths and how they might, anticipate the burial cloth. Just with the name Bethlehem, you already know that you're dealing with sacrifice, because that's where the lambs that bear away the sin of the world are bred, and then they're sent to Jerusalem. So these themes are just throughout the Christmas narratives, if we have eyes to see and ears to hear.
And Jerry, you mentioned earlier today when I was talking to you about, and maybe this is too off topic, but that was really interesting, the humor in the description of Jesus's birth there. How we would lose that reference to the political leaders that were there at that time. Just, I don't know, that might help accent.
Well, yeah, another succession. After Herod dies, who's going to take over? Which son? Right? Archelaus takes over first. But then we see Antipas, right? So we have different sons of Herod. Later there's Philip. These sons want to be the successor, right? So, Tiberius was king, was emperor, right? And it says at a time there was a census, and it's proton census Quirinius, either before the census of Quirinius or before Quirinius was in charge. Now we just roll over that, like we've heard it so many times. Who's Quirinius? Who cares? Just another Bible-y sounding name. Well, the thing is, when Herod dies and the brothers are contending for who will rule, the violence and the incompetence that comes from that violence is so extreme that Caesar steps in and says, neither of you are in charge. Quirinius is going to be in charge. And he's not even in Israel. He's up in Syria, the hated Assyrians, right? He's up in the north. But he's going to be put in charge, and you're going to be humiliated. So in the nativity narratives, there's this little jab that's sort of like, okay, so Herod's king, and we're going to see what he does, and we're going to see him kill people and exercise his authority. This is before his whole dynasty is deposed in favor of a foreign, in favor of rule from a foreign entity. So, but even from the very beginning, that all this fighting over the Messiah and who's going to inherit, and you're going to murder children in order to stop that. The mention of Quirinius reminds everyone it's all going to be gone in 5 or 6 years, because the violence spills over and Rome has to deal with it. So they basically subordinate Jerusalem. So there's a little bit like, I would say something like, when Obama was going to save the world, this is before Trump was president, or when Trump was going to make America great again, before Biden became president. We would get the sense that all of the pretensions of these people we're going to tell you in advance what you already know. We're going to remind you that that's all punctured. And there's a lot of this in the nativity narratives. And even when we can loop back, because I've talked too much, when it says that the Holy Family left Israel to go to Egypt, and it invokes the prophecy, out of Egypt I have called my son. But they're leaving Israel. So Israel is so bad that leaving Israel to go to Egypt fulfills the prophecy about the exodus from Egypt to Israel, because now Israel is another Egypt and Herod's another Pharaoh killing young Jewish boys. So there's a pretty sharp wit at work, I think, in these nativity narratives that we kind of miss.
Jason?
Yeah, I could just sit here and take notes. Jerry, I didn't know that about Bethlehem being where animals were bred for sacrifice, and this idea that God entered, the second person of the Trinity entered this succession battle, and really how satanic it is to compete with God to rule the world. And that's what it was from the beginning. I'm Catholic. During Advent, we pray the Rosary, the joyful mysteries, 3 times a week. And the joyful mysteries are, of course, begin with the Annunciation. And as I've been praying through the joyful mysteries this Advent, the idea of the Annunciation, the Visitation, the Nativity, and I thought the joyful mysteries, they're more like the terrifying mysteries. You have an angel appear to you and say something that's obviously mysterious, but quite frightening, and comes with being shunned by your community and who knows what. And it was brought up with the massacre of the innocents, the flight, being born and in the most horrible of situations. And so as a Catholic, when we pray the rosaries, I always think of the joyful mysteries as the pleasant mysteries. But when we really think about them from the very beginning, it's this solidarity between God with man in the most intimate way from the very beginning, when the Holy Spirit is over the Blessed Virgin Mary, and the second person of the Trinity becomes incarnate, obviously 9 months prior to Christmas. So, what I love about Christmas, and what I'm come to understand, I'm sort of a new Christian, it's 19 years since my baptism and confirmation, is that, as Jerry said, our idea of Christmas is formed with, especially for those of us who are older, with the arts and crafts projects. Even I, as a kid who was raised with no religion in public schools, we would make these little pleasant manger scenes that focused on drummer boys and animals, cute little animals, and really sweet looking angels. Nothing dreadful about that at all, but the rest of it was completely glossed over. And I have to say, when I was a militant atheist, I remember at one point when I finally, with an open mind, read the Gospels, I remember thinking, if this isn't true, the truth couldn't be more beautiful. And this beautiful solidarity between our Creator and the human family, when I first came across, and I was so illiterate. Here I was in college, a senior, before I finally looked at Christianity, was completely illiterate to the Christian religion. So I was really kind of coming to it fresh. And but I thought there could be nothing more beautiful than what I'm reading in the Gospels. And then I eventually had to assent to the truth, although it came with all sorts of pesky rules that I wasn't really excited about. I had to acknowledge that this is the answer to what I saw as an objectivist, the self-evident truth, the self-evident dignity of the human person. This offers the only explanation that I've come across. And the incarnation of God is, I mean, what could be more beautiful? And then he suffers and dies with us. But then we suffered with him. I mean, the proto saints, I guess, of the innocents that are massacred. My sister bought me that icon of the Holy Innocents as a gift when Roe versus Wade was overturned. It's over my shoulder, I think, right there. Can you see it? That was a wonderful gift that my sister gave me. Yeah, so those are my thoughts.
Pastor Jim. Yeah, y'all just jump in from now on.
Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, I think when you were talking about feeling illiterate coming to the Bible as a new and young Christian, I think I had that same sort of feeling when I discovered Girard. That even though I had been a Christian for a number of years and been a pastor for a number of years, when I read Girard, I started to see things differently in Scripture than I ever had seen before. So that was a huge epiphany, if you will, to my understanding. I'm still trying to work my way through it. I can't even say that I have my arms completely around it at this point, even though for a number of years now I've been considering myself Girardian, as a point of reference. But yeah, and then I think when talking about Herod and the slaughter of the innocents and all of these things, and it reminds me of what the Scripture says about Herod when the wise men came and said, where is the King of the Jews? And it said, and Herod was troubled. And I think that that gives us a hint there that there's several things going on. One is the rivalry and the conflict and the violence that follows all of that. But the other thing is that there's a sense in which we are all Herod at that point, and in which when the King of the Jews comes, it puts all of our dominions at peril, and so we're all threatened by that. And I think even living in our Christian life, we have to wrestle with this idea that there's still a little Herod inside of us that wants to be king, that wants to overthrow the king, and that's a daily battle for all of us. So I think that's the whole thing about the mimetic nature that we have is that it's not like you read Girard and then everything's okay. It's like a magic bullet. We wrestle with this mimetic nature all the time in all of our relationships, and that that really is a battle that goes on constantly. So I think that and I still see this working in the Middle East too. Is that one of my friends said, we're talking politics and so forth. And of course, that's another thing when you see the narrative with Herod there, that's another thing you realize that, this is extremely political and deeply anthropological. People always want to divorce Christianity from politics, and that's an impossible thing to do. It's a deeply political thing. And one of my friends, we're talking about politics in Egypt during various, through various revolutions and so forth going on there. And one thing he said is, one thing you need to understand is that Egypt always has to have a pharaoh, that's just ingrained in them. Egypt must have a pharaoh. When we talk about strong men and so forth in the Middle East, but that's just something ingrained in them. So you can imagine how difficult it is for someone like Herod to see a rival coming, and that just sent terror through his very being, and I think, quite frankly, either that puts all of us in a situation in which we either have to minimize Christ and the narrative of the Son of God becoming flesh and so forth, as to make it unreal, because that's the only way humanly people can deal with it, or you have to bow before the king, which is that's it. So the way that they avoid the terror of it is by minimizing it, and then they don't have to deal with it because it's not true, or it's just a myth, or it's part of another monomyth or whatever. But we have but at some point, every knee will bow, every tongue will confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God, and that's going to be horrible for some people, right? That's going to be terror, because you're going to realize at that point that you're not king, that you're not God, that you don't rule over your own life, and then you're confronting the same thing that Herod was confronting in that narrative.
That's very good. That's kind of like an existential point to the story there, that we all have to confront that shadow of Herod in our heart, that we should see ourselves in the story as Herod and not pretend that we're one of the wise men or the shepherds or someone that's more of a heroic figure or a good figure in that story. It's very good.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I heard before is that the wise men were the kingmakers of the day, that no Persian king ever sat on the throne without the consent of the wise men. And so when they show up, Herod knows who they are. He knows these are kingmakers. So that's a much greater threat than just three unknown people showing up in Jerusalem, wanting to know where the King of the Jews is. I think that he could have easily just dismissed that. He knows who they are.
These are like political bosses or something coming from their smoke, their smoke-filled rooms to say, "I think this guy's the one," huh?
And listen to you guys talk about Herod. There's another man who the arrival of Jesus could have launched into some sort of rage, some sort of mimetic rivalry, and been swept away by this contagion. Joseph.
Oh, Joseph. Oh, yes, I see. John's later, right?
Yeah, you think of Joseph. You don't have to go to Aleppo today for a man to think how he would respond to this news. You could go to Albuquerque, right? So the idea that Joseph then would respond this way seems like he's almost immune. And there's writings of a Catholic saint, Anne Catherine Emmerich, and her writings of Joseph and what his personality was like, even as a young man. You would think, now she was writing, well before Girard was born, but you would think she had read Girard, and she's trying to make a personality of someone devoid from mimetic rivalry, that he lived his whole life sort of, he couldn't be swept away. So you think how Joseph responded and how Herod responded. I made a movie, The Stoning of Soraya M., about a husband in Iran. It's a true story, who had his wife stoned to death. You could see someone responding that way, couldn't you?
Well, doesn't that explain why Joseph had Miriam on the trip? Because Roman law did not require that the couple go to the ancestral homeland. So what kind of crazy guy takes a pregnant woman, on a donkey, late stage pregnant woman on a donkey, to some little podunk town during a violent era when there are bandits on the road? Well, one who knows that there's a high probability that she'll become a scapegoat if she's left home. because he might have been, as the scripture says, a righteous man who purposed to put her away quietly. But that's not the village. The views, the views in Galilee were like, if it had happened in Judea, it probably wouldn't have been a death penalty. Like if she were suspected of adultery, that would have been a death penalty in Judea. But in Galilee, stricter. Sex with someone else during betrothal period is a death penalty offense. So she would have been killed, or very likely would have been killed. So that's why he takes her on this terrible trip, so that she doesn't become a human sacrifice against the law, because the Torah didn't say. I mean, you can argue that the Torah says death penalty for adultery, but you need witnesses. There's no Torah position death penalty for sex during betrothal, and there are legal procedures. So it's a little bit like the woman taken in adultery. They say legal, but it was highly illegal, which is something, I think, Jesus basically says, you want to do law? Okay, let's do law. Let's have a trial. But they don't want a trial. As Girard says, trials slow down the scapegoat mechanism. So Joseph is not just not scandalized, I'm using that word, intentionally, by the pregnancy of Mary, but he goes the extra mile to protect her from the scapegoat mechanism by taking her on this trip.
It's interesting.
This underscores.
I was just going to say, it reminds me of the saying before some radio programs, the views and opinions of this program are not necessarily those of the network or the advertisers. I was thinking that would help the biblical narrative pop a little more if people had that disclaimer. The views expressed in this text are not necessarily those of the people around the community, to give you the understanding there, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think all of this underscores, for Joseph as a man who must have been feeling all the things that a man does under these circumstances, must have had the doubts in the beginning. All of this underscores the importance of the revelation that he received through the dreams. That this was for him, the unveiling, the opening of what God was doing, that enabled him to sort of avoid that mimetic response, I think, and that's a situation again that we're all in without revelation. Revelation is what unveils this for us. But I've also seen this carry out in today's world, in the Middle East, where, as Jerry was saying, you have the law on the one side, but then you have the cultural things in rural areas or whatever on the other side, and those people have their own laws, as it were. They're unwritten, right? They're not codified, but they are, they are enforced right to the letter, as it were, because people, things that are not illegal in places like Egypt, in certain areas, in certain parts of the city, or in certain parts of the country, those unwritten laws are carried out with a vengeance. People are stoned, they're burned out of their houses, they're stripped naked down the street, and so forth. So, those things are, go on regularly.
Wasn't Soroya martyred in a rural area?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, and not one to defend the regime in Iran, but they'll often protest when there are these announcements of these stonings, that they do their best to stop them, and they probably do, in fairness. But yeah, there are these communities, even in Turkey, where that there's nothing the state can do. It happens, and that's about the difference.
Yeah. So, but for the humility and bravery of Joseph, Mary was on the Soroya path. Mm-hmm. She was a would-be Soroya M.
And that's in the joyful mysteries for the Catholics listening. That's in the happy story part of
because he was a righteous man. He was a tzedakah. He did protect her.
Yeah.
It's interesting
sorry, I just got it. So like father, like son, let's say like foster father, like son, Joseph is anticipating what Jesus does in John 8. which is saving the life of a woman accused of adultery. I mean, he learned that somewhere. He learned how to be a man.
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
That's really beautiful.
Is that why the Christians came up with the slur for pagans, the word pagan, because it was like country people, because that's where the brutal sacrifices were still taking place? Because Jerry, you mentioned, Romans were very proud of themselves for not doing old school ritual sacrifice, even though they were with crucifixions and stuff.
Right. Rome was very proud that they didn't do human sacrifices. They did a lot of animal sacrifices. They didn't do human sacrifices like all the barbaroi, except they had crucifixion, which was the worst human sacrifice, and a terrible torture. But somehow they suppressed it. So this is the Girardian idea. You suppress the knowledge of the human sacrifice. So it was to say crucifixus in a conversation was not allowed in polite Roman society. It would have been like cussing, would have been like using the F, well.
Or like abortion, the word abortion in the 50s and 60s would have been in this country.
Yes. You couldn't say it on TV.
Yeah.
Couldn't say abortion on TV. And you couldn't say crucifixion because it's got to be tucked away. And off there in the Pagani, and I think you still see in Islamic society, there's Islam in the city, which all the problems we might have with Islam as Christians, well, what it's replacing, the tribal order that it's replacing, there's some law and order in Islam. I mean, maybe women can't be witnesses, but at least there are witnesses, as opposed to just a mob. And Galilee would have been more like that. Eusebius even makes this comment in Ecclesiastical Histories that, what Mary was accused of doing would have gotten you killed in Galilee, but not in Judea. The Judeans would have thought of their country cousins as a little too strict, a little too intolerant.
Now, maybe I'm stretching this too much. You guys can correct me, but, doesn't, and I was listening to this in Gil Bailey's book, Violence Unveiled. Gil Bailey was a contemporary of Rene Girard and still is writing Girardian and mimetic theory ideas in his works. But he mentions in one passage about how Yahweh, he's talking about Moses, is Yahweh is the God of the wilderness. He's out there in the wild world. He's not in the city where the gods are. But yet, so I'm just trying to think in my head biblically, how does that fit with this contemporary context, Jerry, and everything, where it's like, okay, you're more likely to get killed out in those country hinterlands, but yet that's where Yahweh seems to show up in the wilderness instead of the cities where all the fancy gods are very well organized. Maybe I'm just mixing those types there.
Well, and sometimes there was a thought that he's the god of the mountains because of Sinai and the revelation on the mountains, right? So they kept trying to turn him into a henotheistic god, a territorial god rather than the god overall. The reference, but the reference you're making to Rohr, I think, is really important. I mean, what's Girardianism all about? The scapegoat mechanism. Right? The scapegoat. Well, where is the scapegoat scapegoated? He's driven into the wilderness where he dies. So the Azazel, the demon of the wilderness, is where the scapegoat is sent. I think there's commentary there about the nature of the scapegoat mechanism. But I think the Bible tells the most true version, which is basically, I think you draw lots, which goat is the scapegoat and which isn't, which is basically a way, I think, of ritually representing that it's arbitrary. Goat A isn't guilty. Goat A didn't do anything wrong. Goat A didn't bite some kid and now we have to be driven out. It's like flip a coin. Which one is goat A? And that's kind of how the scapegoat mechanism works. It's arbitrary. So I think someone might read the Bible account and say, well, what do you mean the Bible's against scapegoatism? That's where we find it. No, that's where it's named. We find it every place. It's accurately described in Torah.
Yeah, when I was part of the marketing team for the Passion of the Christ, and I remember the night before it came out, I was in the ABC News being interviewed by it, and so I hadn't read Girard. It'd be another 12 to 8 years before I'd read Girard, but it would have helped me market the film if I would have read Girard, because the newscast was Diane Sawyer, I think, and she said, this is the most violent movie ever, and I just blurted out, I said, no, it's not. I said, it's probably the least violent movie you're ever going to see. I mean, you only see you really focus on just one guy, but you can watch James Bond and see 100 guys get killed. I said, this film just shows violence as it is. Violence is repulsive. And I started to notice with Mel Gibson's films going all the way back to Apocalypto, but especially, take out the Lethal Weapon films, which are myth. The Patriot, Braveheart, Hacksaw Ridge, most especially, and Apocalypto, of course, The Passion, of course, and his first film, I think I said Gallipoli. It makes violence repulsive.
We were soldiers.
We were soldiers.
Yep.
Yeah, and violence is repulsive. They're not the most violent movies ever. They just make you respond to violence correctly. You watch James Bond, he whacks a bunch of people and he grabs a lady and on a yacht and then kills some more people, and you're thrilled. It's exciting. It's wonderful. So when you show a thing for what it is, it's in poor taste. We're supposed to make violence palatable.
I think that's true with the way we talk about the cross too, in today's Christianity, and throughout the culture, sort of the pseudo-Christian culture. We mask the violence of it, and it's just not polite to talk about the violence of even the crucifixion of Christ. So I think that's the culture's way of avoiding having to really deal with it, because crucifixion was, all the things leading up through the Passion to the crucifixion were extremely violent, and to watch them portrayed as something like the Passion of Christ shows that, and shows what the correct response is to that. But most dramatizations of violence glorify violence, and I think again that's part of the whole Girard thing. They protect the perpetrators of violence, and they see the victims of violence as deserving or guilty.
Yeah, and that reminds me of I've interviewed I don't know if you guys know Tom Holland. He's a historian. He wrote the book Dominion, and I've interviewed him a few times. And he starts off the book by saying, in Dominion, he talks about the story of him going to Iraq where ISIS was, and they were looking across from this war area where they see crucifixions still taking place. And he said, as a historian, it shocked him into this alien nature that he saw displayed in real time in real current events, where he was living, he was there, and it shocked him into understanding how different the Christian worldview is and how much it shapes the way in which human beings would even consider something as ghastly as the crucifixion. And yet it's in this clash, right? This clash that Tom Holland sees in real time when he's in Iraq. And I know you guys, Jim and Jason, have been over in these war zones. How does that fit into helping accentuate how radical the Christian story is, starting with this nativity?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think the thing that I see there is that there is, we're in the area. When you're in the Middle East, you're in the area of, the cradle, if you will, of Christianity, and then you watch that move all the way around the West, and now I think it's going back there, and when you see how Christianity has changed culture in both the East and the West, and then where and then you see something like the 21 Egyptians who are beheaded in Libya, that's that's an eye-opening brutality that just can't be ignored. I think at that point you realize there's two categories of people. There are murderers and there are martyrs. And, I mean, really, that's all there are. So, and, you either identify with the martyrs or you identify with the murderers. And, but, I think we also have to be careful that, ISIS are not the only murderers. They weren't even the worst murderers. They were sort of a speed bump there for a while, in which drew everyone's attention, to how violent things can be in a certain locality for a certain period of time. But I don't think their murderous behavior doesn't even come close to something like abortion. It's not even a blip on the radar compared to what we've done in this country. And I think one of the things that we've got to get people to see is, especially Christians living in America, is that we've got to get Christians from this point of view where we say their violence is bad violence, our violence is good violence, our violence is always morally justified. Well, that's the myth, see? And if we don't destroy that myth, I mean, we have evangelicals lining up, behind every candidate that runs for president, promising to, invade and overthrow another regime after regime after regime, displacing millions of people, and not to mention murdering millions of people. And we largely keep voting for the same candidates that promise to do this. And our violence is good violence, their violence is bad violence, when really our violence has been much more severe and much more pervasive than their violence. I mean, the violence of America far outweighs anything that ISIS ever did. So, and still does to this day. And we sanction.
And we can argue that ISIS was the creation of our thoughtless regime change war.
It was indeed the creation of America. We that was all part of the plot to overthrow Assad in Syria. So, and it just backfired. And so, our weapons, our money, our plan, our strategy, our targeting. So, that whole thing.
And the same strategy backfired in Ukraine when we funded neo-Nazis in the color revolution.
Exactly the same.
The first Gulf War, we used kerosene bombing and napalm to suffocate and kill countless thousand Iraqis. Barack Obama, over 500 children killed in drone strikes. Civilians, and American citizens, died in Obama's drone strikes. Yeah, but we make a work out of it. Literally, we make.
I just had a call with a friend of mine that said, actually, I think blowback is a feature, not a bug of our foreign policy. I think it's actually part of the design.
I think it certainly is. And, the thing about it is we glorify it and we cheer it. And so, to me, that is, going to Iraq and looking at the violence that ISIS perpetrated, and it was gruesome, horrible, murderous violence, that even made Muslims sick to their stomachs. I mean, it wasn't like, the Muslims were victims of this violence as well. So, but the fact that, to me, the most despicable thing is that, I'm sure Jason, you can speak to the Catholic side of this better than I can, but although I was born and raised Catholic, but, to see Protestants and to see evangelicals rooting for this violence, and supporting it, is what is the most despicable to me. And somehow, I hope that program like this and other things that we all do will have some effect on helping people see that our violence is bad violence. There's no good violence, right? It's all bad. And I think ours, on a scale, far outweighs what any other country in the world is doing. Okay, China isn't going around invading other countries. All right, we always talk about Taiwan. They're going to go to Taiwan, whatever. But their history is not that.
Well,
same with Russia.
I might push back a little. I mean,
Yeah, they've
Tibet,
occupied
Tibet was a country, a whole country.
Yeah, no, I know. Yeah,
I mean,
right.
And a
But
lot
not
of China
to the extent that
was
America has.
modern China.
Well,
It
James,
wasn't always as big as it is now.
James,
So
I work closely with the Uyghurs.
I agree with that.
There
yeah,
are 3 million ethnic Uyghurs in concentration camps.
yeah,
Agreed. Yeah, and here's the thing. Before they started locking the Christians up, I was talking about the Uyghurs, and I said, if we don't speak out, against what China is doing to the Uyghurs, they're just going to keep going.
And they are now. There are disappearing bishops across the country right now.
Yeah,
Jim, there was something
exactly.
I was going to ask you as someone who works in the Middle East, and it perfectly fits with what David brought up. And I'm sure you've heard this. Whenever I meet a Muslim and we're sharing our faith, the first thing they bring up, and I'm sure you hear this all the time, is how repulsive and shocking the crucifix is.
Mm-hmm.
Do you hear that a lot? And I get challenged.
Yeah, sure.
And it's interesting. So that David brought up seeing, and by the way, I don't think it's fair to ISIS. They're not Muslims any more than National Social did not. The SS were Christians. I don't care what they thought of themselves. They're, when I was in Iraq, they were engaged in cannibalism of Yazidi. And there's nothing like
I work
that.
with the Yazidis, yeah.
So as the story of what happened to those mothers and their children. That's nothing a pious Muslim would ever do. But when David mentioned the crucifixion scene of Yazidis being crucified by ISIS, yet whenever I go to a mosque, whenever I meet with my Muslim friends, they always bring up how repulsive the cross is. Isn't that interesting? Where to us, we just see it. It's background noise. But when Muslims see it, it's the cross is quite shocking to them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think
that where they ask you, why do Christians have such a repulsive symbol?
Yeah. Well, I think, for one thing, they're seeing it for what it really is. That's why my point earlier was we don't see it for what it is. We see it as a piece of jewelry. We see it as, sort of glossed over, mentioned in a narrative or a story or whatever. But, they don't really see what it is. And quite frankly, most Romans never saw what it was either, because it was for the slaves. It was for the lower class. It was for, Roman citizens weren't, routinely crucified. So
they wouldn't even admit it. They wouldn't even believe that it happened, right? Like many Jews.
Right. Yeah.
Right. It was suppressed information, and it happens outside the city. It was like a shameful little thing. I mean, it's a lot more like abortion. Before the abortion revolution tried to morally, repair it. It's a shameful little thing that it's the the coat hanger off in a corner. Don't talk about it. Don't think.
Kind of like the pharmakos, or even more shameful than that. The Greek ritual.
Right. The pharmakos is the human sacrifice. That's the medicine.
Yeah, beating the handicapped guy and sending him off out of the city, stuff like that.
Right. So there's a suppression aspect. So I mean, I think the point about the cross is a powerful one. The Muslims are more right about it than most Christians. It's gruesome and it's offensive. I mean, maybe, for a little while we wear little, electric chairs or needles that are used. Yeah. I think that'd be misunderstood.
Guillotines,
guillotine or a hangman, a noose. I think that would send the message, what this sort of thing is about.
Yeah.
Jerry, is that
for the Muslims?
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think for the Muslims, the thing is that they understand Christians believe Jesus is God, and they understand the brutality of the cross, and it's incomprehensible for them that God would crucify His Son. And we would do well to learn a little something from that, repulsiveness that they experience with that.
Right. So, this is something that Girard kind of wrestled with. Did God crucify His Son?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right. As opposed to, did God allow His Son to be crucified by the scapegoat mechanism in the system?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So there's different views of the atonement, but I saw Satan fall like lightning. Girard suggests issues with the penal substitution understanding of the atonement. and kind of tilts a little bit more towards the Eastern Orthodox Christus Victor view of the atonement, explicitly says that. Now, Girard wasn't a theologian. And if you talk to someone like Gil Bailey, it's like Gil would say, well, I'm not sure he understood all the issues.
Girard said that too, right? I mean, I think there were points where Girard skirted with heterodoxy on the atonement. And I'm not a theologian either, but it made me uncomfortable. And someone sent me a video where Girard said, well, if anything I'm saying contradicts the magisterium of the church, I defer to the church.
Right. So there's early Girard in which he's openly critical of passages in the New Testament.
Yeah.
And he speaks only negatively about sacrifice. Later on, he recants that and understands that there is, in fact, a form of mimesis and a form of sacrifice that is good and true, right? Loving self-sacrifice is a good thing. But I don't think that I ever saw, got over his doubts about the penal substitution system of the atonement. Right. And now, did he understand what it was? Do I understand? As someone who's been doing theology for 40 years, this is something that N.T. Wright has mentioned. When he wrote about the atonement, he wrote against a certain view of the atonement that, that he called penal substitution, that he had always heard growing up. And then penal substitution theologians came forward and said, oh, no, that's not what we believe. But other ones came forward and said, oh, no, that absolutely is what we believe. And what Wright basically said is, okay, there might be different theories, but what shows up frequently, like in the Protestant context, or even a Catholic context, what's hitting the pews is this is how much God hated sin. What's happening to Jesus on the cross is God the Father punishing Jesus. Instead of punishing you. That's how much he hates sin. So, I've been on panels where we've said, is that what Anselm said? I don't know, but I can tell you a lot of people believe it. So it's what a lot of people are taking home with them. And I think Girard, sheds doubt on that, is God sacrificing? Is God, what's God doing? Is God the perpetrator of the crucifixion?
I think God in his mercy, whether he did or not, has allowed that idea to flourish through the story of Jesus in the gospel so that man would be more interested in following Jesus. If you understand what I mean there, that it makes it more attractive for human ears to accept that I want to serve the kind of God who needs to take out his wrath in that way, because man needs a God and a picture of God like that to be more desirous of obeying that kind of God, and a God that may be truly unconditionally loving without needing to beat up his son is a little bit not attractive to the human race, that it would have been able to take root so long and stay so attractive to billions of people to this day. That's my opinion, which means I'm not saying whether he did want to do it or not, but whatever he did, I think it was a mercy for God to let people have an attraction to Jesus, because we want a God that's hard to get, even Christians. We don't want a God that's truly unconditionally
I've noticed
loving.
that a certain kind of person in a certain spiritual state gravitates towards the harshest forms of that atonement, partly out of shame. Just in my own experience, somebody who's dealing with a lot of shame issues, then they kind of Good Friday their spiritual life all the time. So it's like, that's how bad I am. That's how bad I am. That's what God wanted to do to me. But God didn't do it to me. He did it to my own son, my only son as well, as opposed to that's what Satan would do to me if God didn't save me, if God didn't protect me. If Jesus hadn't volunteered, if he hadn't done what he did, defeat death, unveil the scapegoat mechanism, that's where I would be. That's where I would be heading, right? So in the Christus Victor view, which I think just really jibes so well with Girard, Girard is saying, here's what Jesus does. He goes there and he willingly sacrifices himself, but it's a trick, right? It's a ruse, right? Which is exactly classic Christus Victor. It's in essence, it is a ransom. It's even Luther said, well, the divine is the hook and the flesh is the worm, and Satan is the fish. You know, so basically the way that Jesus can die is, okay, oh, you here, I'll die, Satan, you can kill me, I'll let, just like Job, redone, except Job is like, do everything except kill him. In this case, God says, you can do anything, but that's Satan's worst decision, because he brings Jesus into his dominion of death, and then Jesus unveils the scapegoat mechanism, and by doing so defeats it. So, I mean, I can see why Girard would be more attracted to Christus Victor than penal substitution, because I think it fits better with his understanding the scapegoat mechanism.
I think they are not wholly unreconcilable. You know, I kind of like the Christus Victor analogy of the atonement, but I don't think you have to completely reject, you know, other views like, you know, the ransom and so forth. You know, these are, I think, you know, different aspects of the atonement.
Well, ransom and Christus Victor are basically the same view, right? So who's Christ paying a ransom to, right? Well, who are we enslaved by? We're enslaved by Satan, and he pays the ransom. You can have me instead, like Aslan to the White Witch. You've got Edmund, you rightfully have him, he submitted himself to you. Will you take me instead? And she did, right? But then there's the satisfaction view that's ensemble, and there's penal substitution. It's probably beyond the, you know, context of this. I'm just kind of observing what Girard said. So he definitely, he got rid of the heterodox view that sacrifice is bad. But I don't think he ever tilted away from the Eastern Orthodox focus of the atonement as a ransom paid to Satan, to undo death. And you see it in Eastern Orthodox iconography. As I've been looking at some of these, like, you know, we have resurrection iconography in the West, and Jesus is coming out of the grave. But in the Eastern Orthodox, in the book Resurrecting Easter, which is a collection of these Eastern Orthodox icons, you have Jesus in hell or coming out of hell, and you've got a cage, and the lock is broken. It's fascinating to see these like locks on the floor as he goes down in to death and breaks it and shatters it, and then comes back out victorious with Adam and Eve and David and Solomon kind of in tow behind him. Right. And Jesus has his robe, and because Jesus is moving at a high rate of speed, his robe is going out behind him. I think this is the first superhero imagery. Jesus is this superhero smashing out of death with his cape behind him, pulling up, you know, those who were sacrificed, those who have died. And I've gotten way off track here, so I'm gonna mute for a little while and let other people talk.
No, it's just good stuff.
No, I'm taking notes. I'm going to get that book, Resurrecting Easter.
Yeah, there's one quote that Girard says that's kind of heterodoxy feeling, because he says something like, and it's not his only view of Jesus's cross perspective, but he says something like, the crucifixion is God's sacrifice to man to ask for forgiveness for leaving them in the dark of sacrificial violence for a long time in history. I don't have it. I'm not doing it justice, but it does say something to that effect of kind of like a sacrifice to man, like. And I don't think that doesn't capture the full, of course, perspective he has on the cross, but he does have this weird kind of angle where he's like, this is God saying like, almost like a sacrifice to man, like not that man, but that's the way God comes in self-giving. Like, you know, here I am in your pain, in your suffering, in your anguish, in your sacrificial brutalities. And I'm here to say, I come into it. I experience the victim's death as a kind of love message to you, that I'm in solidarity with you through all that pain, which I think there's something beautiful about that. I mean, where was God? The question, I mean, that Jesus asked himself, why have you forsaken me? Where was God in those primitive spreading, you know, think about the eagle, the crucifixion the Vikings did to people, where they split their rib cages open. Where's God there? Where's God? You know, and I think there is a solidarity that Jesus is giving humanity there, that saying, I was there with you in that darkness when you were asking, where was God? When you were those other communities that didn't have the gospel, didn't have missionaries tempering that nasty brutality, when you had Persians putting people inside of logs with maggots, eating them alive in their form of torture. Tom Holland recounts that. and they're being slowly eaten alive with honey inside the wood that's carved out. Where's God? Where's Jesus there? And I think Jesus on the cross says, I was there. I was there all along. And there is a kind of love letter there that God is saying, I don't know if it's a sacrifice to man, but a sacrifice on behalf of man, you know, that the Trinity gives itself there, right?
I think what this all says, I mean, initially is that, you know, just when we think we know our God, we really don't. You know, that's why, like, I don't like to work my way through narratives and let them resolve too quickly. Like, you know, when Abraham's told to sacrifice his son, I like to hang out a little while, you know, and just the absolute absurdity of that, you know, what Kierkegaard called it the teleological suspension of the ethical. You know, you got to wrestle with that tension, you know, and I think the same with the atonement and trying to figure all that out. I think it's probably fair to say that Girard's thinking on the atonement probably wasn't complete, wasn't finished. Had he lived a little longer, he might have wrestled a little more. And I think, you know, based on our conversation, I think we all kind of wrestle with that, you know, trying to find the right angle with that. But I think the wrestling with it, you know, with the tension there is good. And I don't think Christians wrestle with tensions enough, you know, to let themselves feel the tension rather than trying to quickly resolve it, you know. And I think that's something that the Eastern Church does a little bit better than the Western Church, especially the Protestant side of the Western Church, is they like to hang out in the tensions a little bit.
I want to go back to Girard's statement for a moment about God sacrificing to man. I mean, what is human sacrifice? Isn't it a sacrifice to man? Isn't it a sacrifice to the wrath of the crowd? Yeah. So, I mean, even if technically you're doing it to some god, we all know that there was no, you know, God wanting a sacrifice. There was no God wanting someone to be eaten by maggots or something like that. It's a sacrifice to the community, right? It's the sacrifice paid for the unanimity of all minus one. It's a sacrifice to human rage, and hatred and accusation. So is Jesus a human sacrifice? Yes. Otherwise he's not unveiling the scapegoat mechanism if Jesus isn't a genuine human sacrifice. I think the difference is who's being sacrificed to, right? And it's interesting, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, right? Eli, Eli, lama, he's quoting the Psalms. My God, why hast thou forsaken me? Except the Psalm says, Eli, Eli, lama asafani. That's my God, why have you forsaken me? Sabachthani is sacrificed. That is the passive form of sacrifice. So Jesus either misremembered the psalm or he's intentionally changing it. So I think there is a sacrifice to the wrath of man. There is, okay, human community, this is what you want to do. I'm going to show you what you are by letting you have my son. And my son's agreeing to it. The son is saying, okay, Father, we're going to show them what they are, what their unbridled lust, their accusation, their mimetic contagion, their violence. We're going to show them what it is. So it's not clear to me that Girard is wrong or even heterodox on that point.
Yeah. There's a quote from Girard that says, the cross enables the truth to triumph because the Gospels disclose the falseness of the accusation. They unmask Satan as an imposter, or to say it another way, they discredit once and for all the untruth of the principalities and powers in the wake of the cross.
Beautiful.
I want to go back to Christmas. Okay. So we skipped ahead, but this is good because Christmas is all about preparing for what's happening on the cross. But just for our listeners, there's folks in the audience that are not Christian and they're listening to this and they're like, okay, because trust me, I get their emails telling me I'm not Christian, but your stuff makes me think about Jesus in a different way. So let's go back to a broader thing that the pop culture, millennials, people that might listen to my show, Gen Z, whoever, in the order, of course, which is, isn't this a myth? Isn't this a myth? This idea of the virgin birth and you got this star thing happening. What's going on here? Is this myth? And we hear, you know, the popular thought that there's all these patterns of dying and rising gods and these little virgin birth stories that all these different religions have. Is this a myth? We're talking about the Christian story here. Jerry, or whoever wants to start.
I think I've used up more than my allotted time. Let's throw it to somebody else.
I don't know. I had a professor in college. It was history of the Third Reich, and it was a professor from Germany, and he was an atheist. But I was a very anti-Christian, and I would antagonize the Christians on campus, as a Randian should. And my professor said at one point, this idea that Christianity is like all religions is the biggest lie. And he was a Marxist. He said it's all the other religions upside down. All the other religions are the same, and Christianity is upside down. It takes it all and it turns it upside down. And I think that's what Girard really discovered, that these religions are myth, and Christianity rips the veil off of myth. It's so uncanny. When I read the gospel, and I'm so grateful that I was illiterate. If I would have gone to a Chicago Catholic high school, I would have lost the faith. Jim, I think you're PCUSA. I discovered I bought a book, The Christian Manifesto by Francis Schaeffer, at a garage sale. It's an atheist. Yeah. And that's the book that was really where I began my journey towards the faith.
Great book. Yeah.
Yeah. And so wow, what a grace to discover that book.
Sure.
And the title to me was uncanny. So I thought, what Christian Manifesto? This is very strange.
Yeah. Yeah. Kind of like the Communist Manifesto.
Yeah, right.
That's when I saw that, that's what, I thought about. Oh, wait, what is this? Christian Manifesto? Yeah.
Yeah. So I would say, if you're in the audience and you're not a Christian, or I really feel sorry for you if you were raised in a conventional Christian family, then you have the harder task of sort of unlearning what you were taught or not taught. But I was just so grateful that I came to the New Testament. I was a rabid anti-Christian who knew nothing about Christianity, but I had all sorts of opinions on Christians. And I'm just so grateful that when I read the Gospels, it was just striking to me. And it struck me as not a myth, is the most implausible myth ever.
Mm-hmm.
Plausible myth.
Yeah, I think I'd like to go right directly to Girard to answer David's question in the introduction to I See Satan Falling, because this was, the opening paragraph there is what really grabbed me about Girard right off the bat. And that is that to most of us, it goes without saying that similarities between mythology and the Gospels play into the hands of religious relativists. That is why Christians have always denied and minimized their importance, with disastrous results. I agree that these similarities should be boldly explored. Far from threatening Christian uniqueness, they provide the sole basis upon which it can be made obvious and unquestionable. How can this be? All mythical and biblical claims, including the Passion, represent the same type of collective violence against a single victim. Myths see the victims as guilty. Oedipus has really killed his father and married his mother. The Bible and Gospels see the same victims as innocent, unjustly murdered by deluded lynchers and persecutors. Jesus is the unjustifiably sacrificed Lamb of God. And so, I just think like what he's doing there is showing, look, there's great similarities between myth and the Bible. And those should be explored. But this is still an antidote to the monomyth. The Christianity is not just one more part of the monomyth, not just another way of looking at all the other myths. The differences also need to be explored. And there are great differences between myth and the biblical narratives that I think are the antidote that are subversive to the myths itself.
I think also Girard helps us, if we're willing to face it, helps us understand our motives. And I can tell you, when I was an atheist, I came to realize that I was an atheist for mimetic, rivalrous reasons, because atheists were smart and Christians were stupid, right? That was I wanted to be one of the smart people. So I had read Bertrand Russell, I'd read Karl Marx, I had read Erich Fromm, some Nietzsche. I read that, and these were because I found them in the college bookstore. So, I was a high school student. I was hanging out in the college bookstore. I would buy these books, Marcusa. This is the Smart Set. And they were my model, and I wanted to be like them. And at some point, I thought, this is what I actually believe. And that's what Girard would call the romantic myth. Is that what he calls it? A romantic myth? The idea that, that my views are authentic to me, the romantic illusion, that my views are authentic to me. I just believe it because I believe it because that's who I am. When in fact, somebody's telling you who you are and you're following them. And at that moment, you feel so independent and fierce of mind because you're not like all those Christians when in fact, you're much more imitative than they are. Because they're countercultural and you're not. You're sucking up to the ruling class. And I remember later seeing an interview with Michael Shermer from Skeptic Magazine, and someone said, "Well, how did you become an atheist? What was your arguments?" And he said, "Well, I went to a party. I think it was a faculty party. There was a certain group of people. I just liked the way they looked. I liked the way they dressed. I liked the way they talked, and they were atheists. So I wanted to be like them." Okay, so I don't know if other people listening, if your atheism is like my atheism. But my atheism was me pretending I was different when I was just imitating people higher up the social hierarchy. And once I started reading Augustine, C.S. Lewis, Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, that cured me at least of that part. Like, oh, wait, historically, Christians are the geniuses. They're the smart people. Now I can think about this and maybe get away from my intellectual pride. And the other thing I'd say, just to follow up to Pastor Fitzgerald, Jesus tells the story of human sacrifice in the Gospels. It's the first time it's told, with the idea that the human sacrifice is actually innocent. If you say that the Gospels are myth, you're denying that discontinuity. And if you're denying that discontinuity, you're siding with the oppressor, right? The oppressor says, you buy into the myth. You think, the oppressor tells the myth in order to cover up the murder. If you read the gospel accounts and you say that's a myth, then you're still in the myth that's being being uncovered. You're siding with Pilate and Herod and the mobs and all the rest of them by not being willing to participate in Jesus's unmasking of the myth. You're siding with the oppressor. You're deciding with the human sacrifice system.
But what if they say that and they say, "I'm a pacifist and I still believe it's a myth," Jerry? I don't believe in any of these wars. How do you do that?
Well, you're pacifist because of the Gospels, right? And you're not giving them credit. So you're adding sacrilege to mythology in that you're stealing a morally appealing and also socially advancing aspect of the gospel accounts. Because to be a pacifist is to be above the crowd. So you're taking a little bit of the gospel story out of its context so that you can feel superior. So you still believe in the myth. You're still siding with the oppressor because you're denying the Jesus who was the first one and the only one who ever really, exposed it. But on top of that, you're trying to still a little Jesus juice for yourself and be a pacifist, stealing an element of the gospel that is sorry, I mean, it's just the truth. I know it's tough, but you're stealing just enough of the gospel to be self-praising.
Jerry, that's what I discovered as a young Randian, Jerry, that Ayn Rand's exalted vision of the human person had been ripped off from the gospel.
Yes. And spliced onto a Soviet metaphysics, right? So Ayn Rand is completely in line with Marx and Lenin on metaphysics, but she takes a little bit, she filches a little bit from the altar, a little bit of the bread of Christ or a little bit of the wine, but it was
understandable because the scandal of the Christians and the socialists around her. So she wanted to, her whole life had been ambushed by violence. First as a young girl, pogroms to her community, and then the Bolsheviks. So anyone speaking altruism, she assumed was about to chop her head off. And so she, in her place in time, she tried to cobble together a defense for this vision of the human person that she accepted as self-evident, but it came from Christianity.
Right, and that's on us more than on her.
On us. No, when I see Christians and conservatives love to beat up Ayn Rand, I'm like, study her life and her community and what she experienced as a young person, and it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, you talk about scandalized. A lot of millennials, again, in my generation, have lost their faith around the time that the war on terror was being prosecuted. And a lot of them just lost their zeal for joy for Christmas. They lost their zeal and belief in God because of the failed, botched sacrifice of the American Empire's torture and wars and all the pictures that people saw, the videos they saw, and they saw the evangelical and every other conservative major church in America say, hey, we're raw on this on. And when you have a botched sacrifice and you slander Jesus's name and say, this is the God that stands for these botched sacrifices, no wonder that my generation has lost a lot of its fervor. You can always make other reasons, but for their fervor for joy in Christmas.
Well, read Joe LeConte's
they want to be around.
Read Joe LeConte's book. What is it? The witch, the wardrobe, and something or other. It's his story of the experience of C.S. Lewis and Tolkien in World War I. And what he basically talks about how all these pulpits were aflame with go out there and fight the Hun. And then there's this horrific violence, and essentially people come back from the war associating the war with Christianity, and that's where you get a wave of atheism, coming forward. A Hobbit, a wardrobe, and a great war.
Great book.
Yeah, really is. And it's making the same point that the jingoism and Christianity get mixed together. And so it's no surprise how atheistic Britain is, because to the degree it was an imperial religion and it's post-empire, why wouldn't it be post-Christian? If it's Christianity was imperial Christianity, then you put down the white man's burden and his religion along with them. I would just say, well, that wasn't Christianity. So you try real Christianity rather than the imperial version.
Now, one distinction Girard helps us see about mythology in the virgin birth part of this story in the Nativity is the idea of that the pagan myths always had a god violently assaulting a mortal, right? Whenever they would have a story like Hercules. Whereas with God, there's this radical revolution of there's a consent, there's a consent. That was so radical in that time period to even consider a story like that would accept the maiden with no power really, but yet you get to have you're going along with this. This is not an assault story like Hercules or other gods that had this virgin birth narrative. So it inverts the idea of a virgin birth in that part of the story, right?
Yeah, exactly.
I was just reading Justin Martyr on this.
Assault or rape.
Go ahead. I'm sorry. No, please.
No, I was just going to say, to David's point, in the myth, there's always an assault or a rape, with respect to the virgin birth, and that's what differentiates it from the biblical narrative of the virgin birth.
Right. And I was just reading Justin Martyr on this, and he's saying, so these pagan births, they're not virgin births. The woman's not a virgin. The virgin doesn't conceive. If Zeus turns into a bull or whatever and penetrates the woman, she's not a virgin. So what Justin Martyr is saying is that this is unlike the pagan myths because it says a virgin shall conceive. Not a virgin will have sex and then conceive. When she's conceiving, she's still a virgin. No sexual act has taken place here.
Right.
Is that when you see that in the story, is that something that the audience would have picked up on, the immediate audience of the Gospels account, Luke and so forth? Would they have not seen that? Would they have seen that contrast, or was that meant for a larger pagan Gentile audience to catch that difference? Anybody think about that?
I think it's a powerful contrast.
Yeah, I think it's a powerful contrast, and not only that, I think it's been prepped to be received in that way from Isaiah. So why did God?
If God is the author of this, because I want to get this across, this is the heart of Christmas here. If God is the author of this story, what is the narrator's intention by making his son's birth so scandalous? Isn't there another way he could have done the virgin birth without the scandal part of it? What does he want us to learn in that story? I mean, I've taken the lesson of, well, he doesn't have the same obsession with the appearances of evil like we do, right? Because if he did, why did he start his birth story with such a scandalous thing that around the community would have really been a head scratcher in terms of moral consideration for that? Why does he decide to tell that story? He could have done the virgin birth, technically, right? I mean, maybe I'm getting this factually incorrect, but couldn't they have gotten married and then he could have done the virgin birth and before anybody, and Joseph and Mary just go along with, as if it's, it's obviously from God, but they, the world doesn't know the difference. Why does he decide to do it in this scandalous way? What does the author want us to know by this?
Well, go ahead, Jason.
Oh, I was gonna say, that's a good question I've never thought of. It's a good question. And I don't want to try to dive into the mind of God on that, but other than from the very beginning, it is a scandal.
Kind of a big part of the Christmas story, isn't it? I'm not saying
No,
we have to have an
it's not a
answer.
side issue, right? It's driving the story. So, by the way, on this issue of whether it would have contrasted, remember what's going on in Greek philosophical circles around this time, including the Alexandria, which is almost certainly where Jesus hung out, when he left Israel. I mean, if you're a Jewish family trying to hide in Egypt, the biggest Jewish community, outside of Israel was in Alexandria. The Alexandrian school was struggling with the issue of how to deal with these rapist gods. So they invent a hermeneutic of typology, so they essentially demythologize the Iliad and the Odyssey and all these myths. So everyone was aware that they had really lousy gods. I mean, it's a big issue. So to have a God who asked permission first that would have been setting up like a signal flare of attention. But so why a virgin birth? Well, because the woman was deceived, but the man wasn't. And so the seed of the woman will crush the head of the serpent. That's the proto-evangelium.
But why did he do it in a way where it looked scandalous? Why didn't he do it where she wouldn't be scandalized and it would have been, we're going to marry and then they're going to just think it's Joseph's son, but it's actually, we're going to proclaim that it was a virgin birth and everything is done in a very tidied up way that doesn't scandalize and make them look sinful? Because
the prophecy is that it will be the seed of the woman. So it has to, it's not something to be hidden. It's a fulfillment of a comment is being made about Adam here. I don't want to get into too much detail here, but Adam is worse than the woman, and the man is worse than the woman in the story. She's deceived. He's not. He knows what he's doing. So the promise is that the Messiah will come through her. And then she's renamed Eve, the mother of all living, not because she's going to have all the babies, but because she's going to have the baby. So she's the one through whom life comes, right? So the failure of men, and Girard talks about differences between men and women in terms of mimetic rivalry, et cetera. The failure of men is in Adam. So God says, I'm going to, Adam was in charge. We're going to need a new Adam, right? And that new Adam isn't going to come from this Adam. That new Adam is going to come from this wife. So I think a virgin birth is essentially just what you see prophecies in the Old Testament that are like fulfilled in the New Testament with like extra energy, right? So, the seed of the woman is going to do this. He's so much the seed of the woman that there's no seed of the man whatsoever. That's a virgin birth. So I think it's in continuity with Genesis chapter 3. And the reason it's scandalous is because it's inherently a scandalous thing. Men should be scandalized by it. To the degree that we're in Adam and act like Adam, we should be scandalized by the fact that we can't be involved in bringing the Messiah into the world, that it had to be through the woman and through a humble maidservant in her own description. So I think if they had gotten married, but she conceived, but they didn't have sex yet, it wouldn't have been as clear. It would have been obscured. Well, yeah, of course you had sex. We don't believe your story. Yeah.
And it would have been adultery in Judea as well. As you said, there was this difference. There would have been nowhere to hide.
Yeah, that's a good point.
If Joseph's like, that's not my kid,
right?
Then there would have been nowhere to hide.
Mm.
I don't know.
Yeah, and I think it also.
I'm not a theologian. I don't want to. They just defrocked Father Frank Pavone. I don't want to be excommunicated, so I don't want to go too far astray. Vatican's on a terror this week.
Yeah. But I think it also, it says something about God, right? I mean, this is something that only God would do. If men were writing the story, they would have tried to resolve that beforehand. They would have anticipated the problem and then tried to resolve it. But I think this tells us that this is something that God is doing, rather than just men writing a story trying to resolve all the tensions beforehand.
David, you asked this question. Do you have thoughts on this, or the things you've read?
Well, I do think that one of the things you can conclude is what I suggested, is that it's showing that God wants us to be skeptical of, Pastor Jim, I remember one of your sermons you did that I heard years ago. You said this keeping up with the Joneses thing about keeping up with appearances. What's that Miss Trebuchet show that you were talking about? She was always considered a bouquet. Her name was Mrs. Bouquet. And she always wanted to make sure, and they would call her Bucket, Mrs. Bucket, but she said, it's Mrs. Bouquet, right? And and the idea was of trying to show holiness, right, in that mimetic competition. And I think God is, and I'm not saying it's the only intention there, but he's trying to get us to get rid of that keeping up with the rules for the rules' sake Christianity of like, look, I am very, everything is, obviously there's something about, the appearances of evil that we should be wise about. But the way God saves the world, he shows up, and the moment he crashes into the scene, it's extremely scandalous and very, very much something that would offend a religious mind who's pious. And that's kind of one of the things I've learned from that when I think about it.
And also absolutely unique. I mean, this narrative is absolutely unique. Only happens once. Nothing before it, nothing after it. So I think that's part of the uniqueness of it. Which to me goes to make it legitimate.
Those
I
are
think.
the good.
Go ahead. No, go.
I was just gonna say those are the good old days when Christians, tried to put on an air of piety. Now we have to put on the air of a great story arc.
Mhm.
I was the worst sinner ever. I smoked pot, I slept with a few girls, blah, 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 blah. I long for the old days where we just, kept it simple. We didn't have to.
And I think there's a danger in being scandalous as a new form of mimetic rivalry, right? So I don't think God ever did anything scandalous just to be scandalous. Right. I think God did what is in God's nature to do, and it's scandalous because of us. So when I talk to people about hermeneutics and I say, if the Bible seems weird to you, the Bible's not weird, you are. And the weirder the Bible seems to you, the more you have to change. So we haven't, there was a book about how Jesus turns the world upside down, turns things up. No, it was upside down. He's turning it right side up. But if you're upside down, it looks like he's turning it upside. These are the men that are turning the world upside down, say the critics of the apostles. No, but they're turning it right side up.
Did Paul say to Jason, you'll turn the world upside down? But he meant right side up.
So I think, there's a reason to come there, right? There's a reason to come to the edge of society. And they're essentially a royal family, right? They're of David's line, but they're on hard times, right? So there's a reversal here. And it's interesting, Mary travels, she says, let it be, as you say, but she basically, when she's dealing with the angels, she simply submits to God. There's not a lot of commentary. How can this thing be, right? But then she travels down, quote, into the Judean mountains or into the Judean hill country, where she meets her socially superior cousin, Elizabeth, who is a Judean, not a Galilean, and whose husband is of sufficient status that he offers incense in the regular rotation of offering incense in the holy place. So they're higher up. There's a social hierarchy. And this Elizabeth, who is above Mary, almost certainly in wealth and certainly in social status, says that the mother of my Lord should come to me. And in response to that, Mary sings a little song that we know as the Magnificat, which is all about a social reversal. But you don't get the Magnificat when at the Annunciation. You get the Magnificat after Elizabeth confesses Mary's superior status. She's so, and the Magnificat is very much like, my soul doth magnify the Lord. I'm a humble maiden. He'll deposuit, the powerful from their thrones. So there's a revolutionary thing here, but Mary is more virtuous, right? So God incarnates in a virtuous woman. And in a society that's this perverse, virtuous people are going to tend to be at the bottom. It's like when Solzhenitsyn, someone said to Solzhenitsyn, where are the good people in Russia, in the Soviet Union? He said, oh, go down to the government building. You want to find the best people? Go to the government building and then go in the bathroom and see who's cleaning toilets. Those are the best people. And so it's not intentionally scandalous. It's just in a world upside down. The people of virtue are going to tend to be people of lower social status because the status is built on mimetic rivalry.
And I think when you talk about the scandal as the starting place for that, based on David's question, and then you look at the reversal in Elizabeth's, Magnificat, then the distance is greater because of the scandal initially that was there, and so that makes the exaltation greater as well. So it emphasizes it.
Very good. Well, I want to land the plane here, and if you guys want to have any parting thoughts on Christmas, I'm going to give you my final question, and we'll wrap it up within 10 minutes here because I got to get on for the radio show live. But it says, the angel of the Lord appears, and the heavenly host join with the angels, praising God and saying, glory to God in the highest heaven, and on earth peace to those whom his favor rests. From a Girardian standpoint, you could say that's the victim. The favor rests with the victim. But how do you guys take that as we wrap up here?
It's a heavenly army. It's heavenly host. It's Sabaoth. So how does God wage war? By becoming a baby of a humble woman and going sleeping among the stinking animals. That is so different than the way that we wage war. It is war. Christmas is D-Day. But it's an unarmed soldier, one unarmed soldier being sent into the world. What could be more anti-mimetic than that? More anti-violent than that?
Yeah, I think that Philippians 2, where it talks about let this mind be in you that was in Christ Jesus, who humbled himself, taking on all the attributes. In other words, who had all the attributes of God, was in every way like him, meaning that all the properties that belong to God belong to Jesus. He humbled himself and became a man and was found in the likeness of a man. Again, he had all the properties that make someone human. And so, this is, again, it's the anti-myth, it's, Jesus who is exalted, is, and Paul is saying, be like Jesus, imitate Jesus. Let this mind be in you that was in Jesus, who humbled himself and took on flesh, became a man, and so this is what humanity is supposed to look like. Jesus is fully human and fully God. We are neither fully human or neither God. We are in the process of becoming more fully human, which is the picture of Christ. And so, that's what Christmas does. It makes us more fully human, which means that it's the only cure, as it were, for our mimetic nature, to get us off the treadmill, as it were, of just trying to imitate, coveting, desiring what our neighbor has, what we think our neighbor has, what our neighbor wants. And it's interesting that Christmas seems to be all about what we can get now. People always ask, I've been asked 100 times, what do you want for Christmas? I don't want anything for Christmas. What can I possibly have? I don't want anything for Christmas. I have to try to make myself think of what I want for Christmas, but our and that's because of Christ, really, but the mimetic nature, we the 10th commandment, thou shalt not covet. And we want what our neighbor has. We want what we think our neighbor has. We want to be what our neighbor is. And so that also is enlightening too, because I think a lot of Christians think, oh, desire is something that comes from the inside. It's purely internal. And what Girard is saying is, no, it actually comes from the outside. It's external to us. And man, I think our whole view of Christmas has reversed that reality. We think desire is coveting, envy is something internal, and it's really external. And I think the model of Jesus, right? We're not Buddhists. We're not trying to extinguish desire, right? We're trying to have our desire on the proper object and the proper model, which is Jesus. And he came into this world as the light of the world, right? And the Word became flesh, dwelt among us. We beheld his glory, and he's our model now. He's more than a model, but he's not less than a model. And I think that's what I think we should focus on at Christmas is Christ is through the Holy Spirit is constantly trying to make us more like Jesus, and that's what I think the hope of Christmas is.
Yeah, for me, I was thinking as I was listening to you talk, Pastor, raised not a Christian. Jerry, I believe you were also not raised a Christian. As a kid, though, boy, from Thanksgiving on, I had that Sears catalog, and my mother had me at 16, and we lived in Section 8 housing, but I circled like half the toys in the Sears catalog, and through the catalog was this big, and I throw it at my mom, and nothing got me as so excited as the Sears Christmas catalog. And although we had never darkened the door of a church, and I was sort of inculcated with an anti-Christian prejudice, my children, though, have been raised Christian. And it's so frustrating asking them what they want for Christmas because they just seem utterly not. I have 7 children, but they seem utterly always uninterested in Christmas presents. And it's just frustrating trying to coax it out of them. But they will say, oh, can we go to midnight mass? And what's sorrowful for me is to think that, and this might sound overly harsh, but how many people are just being swept away with kind of banal existences, especially if you have children. And so what I would say is you have to go to midnight mass, find the local church, go to mass on Christmas Eve. And then the next thing I would say to do is you could see the face of Christ, we're told, through prison ministry, through caring for our neighbors without homes. I think the best way to do it in today's society is to stand up against this Holocaust of abortion, volunteer for your local crisis pregnancy center. And when you do these things, I forget what you, I apologize if I seem distracted. I'm running right now. We have 200 Afghan Christians that we had to change safe houses. And I'm putting out a fire on my phone as we're doing this call, but and I forget exactly how you worded it, David, but I always say this, that in life there is Palm Sunday and there's the cross and the Nativity, or as Jerry said, D-Day. Let this Christmas be your D-Day. And when you are at the Nativity, again, the Nativity was a very lonely place. The cross was a very lonely place, but you're with the most beautiful people in the world. And so that's the place I want to be. And you can be there when you visit those who are in prison, when you visit your neighbors without homes, oftentimes struggling with addiction or PTSD or intellectual disabilities. And this is where you can see the face of Christ. And then you find out the secret, which I'm always fearful that I'm becoming a victimist because I just know the secret too much, which is that this is just the best way to live a beautiful life. And it's going to fill you with joy. And so as Jerry said, I love that. I would hope for anyone from one atheist, former atheist, to those who've never been to church, maybe addled with prejudice, let this Christmas be your D-Day, and just go to peek around, see what the heck's going on. And I think you'll want to go every Sunday. I go every day, but you'll want to go at least every Sunday.
Well, Jerry Bowyer, Jason Jones, and Pastor Jim Fitzgerald, Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas. God bless
Merry
us,
Christmas,
everyone. David.